much for joining me today. We're continuing our study of John this week with a look at chapter 10. Will you pray with me as we get started? God, thanks so much for today. We thank you for your word. We thank you for how you speak to us through these words that John recorded all of those centuries ago, God. And we pray that as we read and as we discuss, as we think and ponder, God, that you will illuminate your word for us and transform us. We love you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So John 10. Y'all, we are just about halfway through this gospel. And this chapter is going to be really one of Jesus's last public discourses in John. So it's coming on the heels of the healing of the man who was blind from birth. Last week we talked about that in chapter 9. And there was a conversation about spiritual blindness. And then chapter 10 begins, and it just begins with Jesus talking. And so is it connected to chapter 9? Maybe. It could be. Really, we don't know. It's not necessary that it is. But we do know that it is around the time of the festival of dedication. We find that in verse 22. Then came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem. And it tells us it was winter. And so we know that it's sometime around that festival. Another thing to keep in mind as we are reading is that this is the last year of Jesus's ministry. We're moving quickly towards the crucifixion. The narration about that last week, about Holy Week, is going to begin in just a couple chapters over here in chapter 12. So we are getting really close to that final week in Jesus's life on earth. Another thing to think about as we're reading is how the tension with the religious leaders is continuing to increase. We saw that last week. We'll see it again this week. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and just dive right in. We'll talk a little bit more about the festival of dedication when we get to that verse over in verse 22. But as we are reading through, we're going to see a lot of shepherd imagery. And Jesus starts that right off the bat. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And then verse 6 says, Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So we get just thrown right into this conversation or these teachings of Jesus. And he's using imagery of sheep and a shepherd to convey his message. And we're going to continue to build on that. But I want us to pause here before we talk about all these things that Jesus says and think about how often we see shepherd imagery in the Old Testament. Psalm 23 is one of the first ones that pops to my mind. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And it goes on. I encourage you to go and read that and think about God being described as the shepherd of Israel. So we see that in Psalm 23. We see it also in Psalm 80 and Psalm 100 and several other Psalms. Isaiah 40 talks about God being the shepherd of Israel. If you look at verses 10 and 11, see the sovereign Lord comes with power and he rules with a mighty arm. See his reward is with him and his recompense accompanies him. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. So I encourage you to just pause here for just a minute and perhaps grab a Bible that has a concordance in the back. This Bible doesn't actually have a concordance, but this one does. So if you look at the very back of your Bible, you'll find what's called the concordance, and it's a place where you can look up different words, and it will tell you what verses, or at least some of the verses that those words appear. So I flipped to sheep or shepherd. There's two different entries, and so there's an entry under sheep, and it lists all the different, many different verses where that comes up, and then shepherd. It gives verses from Genesis all the way through Revelation that talk about shepherds. So I encourage you just to kind of look through those lists and see what the Bible has to say about God being the shepherd of Israel, and just how else that shepherd imagery shows up specifically in the Old Testament. But one of the other ways that shepherd imagery does show up in the Old Testament is the leaders of Israel were called the shepherds of Israel. So if we think about King David, he was called a shepherd of Israel. So if we look over at Psalm 78, we're going to look at verses 70 and through 72. It says, he chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people, Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands. He led them. So David would be an example of one of the shepherds of Israel that was a good shepherd. We've spent a lot of time in 1st and 2nd Kings recently, and we saw a lot of examples of bad kings, or what we would say are bad shepherds. And then we see here in this very beginning, Jesus talking about these bad shepherds. And there are also many verses in the Old Testament about these bad or false shepherds. So if we were to look at Ezekiel 34, I think that is an excellent example. We've studied Ezekiel together not too terribly long ago. But in this passage of Ezekiel, we have a very bleak picture painted of these shepherds. And so Ezekiel is told to prophesy to the shepherds of, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel and say, woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. And he goes on and continues to talk about how poor of a job these shepherds have done and how they are only looking out for themselves. And so we'll return to this here in a few minutes, because that's not where he leaves things. And I'm pretty sure we talked about this passage when we studied Ezekiel. But it's Ezekiel 34. I encourage you to go read the entire chapter. So back to these false shepherds. In these opening verses of chapter 10, Jesus is painting this picture between true shepherds and false shepherds, or good shepherds, bad shepherds. And the way he's describing these good shepherds, let's look at it. The good shepherd is one who enters by the gate, and he is one who calls the sheep by name, and they listen to his voice because they know his voice. And he leads them from the front, leads them out. And this is how he describes this. And one of the commentaries I was reading this week was so fascinating. They were talking about shepherds in the Middle East. And one of the things we need to think about when we think about that part of the world is the amount of desert landscape there is. And so this would have made food scarce, water scarce, and there would have been a lot of perils. I mean, sheep are not the most defensible animals. They are not able to really defend themselves much. And so they really rely on their shepherds to take care of them. So the sheep would have been herded into enclosures at night that would have perhaps backed up to a cliff and maybe be surrounded by some stone walls, or they'd be in a part of a canyon where it was a natural, stone wall or thorny branches kind of covering it, and there would have been a gate with only one opening, and it would have been guarded by the shepherd. And that's what we see described here by Jesus. And one of the other interesting things that I read this week is that shepherds in that part of the world were and are known for talking and singing to their sheep. So it's not just, oh yeah, I keep track of these sheep. Yeah, we're good. No, they talk to them, they sing to them, and some even carry a small flute type instrument and will play a certain tune. And the sheep are trained to follow and recognize this tune or the song or the voice of the shepherd. And they are able to essentially lead their own sheep, and they won't respond when they hear an unfamiliar voice. They follow their shepherd. And so that is a lot of information and background about shepherds, but I think it really does a lot to illuminate this passage. At least it did for me this week as I was reading and studying. And so we see here, after Jesus gives this opening figure of speech to the Pharisees, they just don't understand, as they often don't. They misunderstand often. And this then gives Jesus the opportunity to give an explanation. And here we're going to get two more I am statements. So I'm going to read starting in verse 7, and I'm going to stop and talk about it. It says, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." So let's pause right there. So first, Jesus says, I am the gate. So he is the gate, or some translations say door. He is the way of access from one point to another point. In essence, one world to another world. We've seen it in other parts of the New Testament described as the narrow way. One commentator, Lesslie, Newbigin, put it this way: that Jesus is the ladder by which traffic between heaven and earth is carried, which I thought that was an interesting metaphor. But he is the access point for the sheep, for those who are going to be a part of his flock. And he gives this abundant life, this image of the shepherd protecting and providing for and the needs of sheep in the midst of a very stark landscape. And remember the desert kind of landscape. This image is so vivid, and thinking about this shepherd leading them to pasture safely and leading them along the safe paths. Think about Psalm 23, all the different things that the Lord as shepherd does. And then the sheep will flourish under his shepherding. So Jesus is saying, I am the gate, and I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So being able to flourish and be completely content and provided for in every way. That is what being in his flock is. And then he's going to go on and he says, I am the good shepherd. This is verse 11. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. And so Jesus is the good shepherd. Only the good shepherd is the one who will stay. This isn't a cuddly image of Jesus holding the cute little lamb and just snuggling with it. It's this image of this idea of shepherding being a hazardous task. So a hazardous job, having to protect these defenseless animals against all of the things that want to try to harm them, whether it's other animals, whether it's thieves or robbers, or it is just the weather itself. But that is the shepherd's job. And so Jesus is the good shepherd who is going to put himself between his sheep and those evil, wicked ones who are coming to hurt, or the wolf that is the ravenous wolf that's coming to attack. He's going to put himself between the danger and the sheep. What's more, he's going to lay down his life for the sheep. And Jesus says he does this willingly. He is willingly going to put himself between danger and the flock. This just shows us so much about his love. And so he goes on in verse 14. It says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. And then he goes on and talks a little bit more about laying down his life for his sheep, and that being his willing choice. But I want to focus here on this one flock and one shepherd, and the sheep that are outside of the sheepfold. You remember, Jesus is talking to primarily Jewish audience at this point. We know that the Pharisees were there. They're the ones who we heard about earlier in this chapter. Verse 19 is going to talk about the Jews again. So he's talking to a primarily Jewish audience. And the Jewish audience would have said, well, we're God's chosen people. We are God's flock. The people of Israel are the flock of the one true God. But Jesus is saying there are some who are not a part of this one, who are not in this sheep pen, and I have to bring them too. So this flock that's going to be one flock and have one shepherd is going to be made up of Jews and not Jews. So Gentiles. This flock is going to have some people in it that they were not expecting. And we are told here in verse 19 that those who heard him, so the Jews who heard these words, were again divided. Now, this is the third time we've been told in John's gospel that the people are divided after Jesus has been speaking. The first time is back in chapter 7. If you look at verse 43, that's where we find that. And that is in the discourse at the Feast of Tabernacles that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And then the next one is in chapter 9 in verse 16 when the Pharisees are trying to figure out what to do about this man who was blind, who now can see. So the people are divided after they experience or see or hear Jesus. And they are this way here. Some of them, we're told, want to say that Jesus is demon possessed and he's mad. He's completely insane. So are they saying, is he actually possessed by a demon? Probably some of them really were saying that. But other ones are just saying he's just crazy. And then other ones are saying, but someone who's possessed by a demon or insane and crazy wouldn't be able to open the eyes of the blind. There seems to be this recognition, similar to what the blind man was experiencing last week. No, this is evidence of God's hand. These are good things. God is in the business of doing these things. It should at least give us pause. And then we come to verse 22, and this is where we find out that they are at the Festival of Dedication. The Festival of Dedication is Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is a festival that is celebrated in the winter. December is what we're used to, and it moves because it's based on a lunar calendar. So it's in a specific month of the Jewish lunar calendar. And so it moves a little bit between November and December, but it's always in that December time frame. We usually associate it with being around the time of Christmas. But the Festival of Dedication was a festival that began in about 160 BC. Now, this is during the Greek period. So what happened on the pages of world history is the Greeks are in power at that time, and there has been increased amounts of Hellenization or becoming more and more Greek across a lot of regions. We have Alexander the Great who comes in, and then there's several other leaders that kind of come in through that time. And so in 165 BC, a Jewish man by the name of Judas Maccabeus comes in and wants to come in and purify the temple and get rid of these. Well, one, Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the rulers, had desecrated the temple. There's pig's blood that was thrown over the altar, and there was a pagan idol erected inside the temple. And so there was just all of these terrible things going on. There were priests who were corrupt and were not following the law, and they were becoming increasingly Greek and taking in Greek culture and Greek customs into their worship. Now, what does this sound a little bit like? Reminds me a little bit of what we read back in Ezekiel, whenever he had that vision of the temple and all the terrible things that were going on in the temple, and God's glory departed from the temple. So that's what's going on in this time period, is the time period between the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And so Judas Maccabeus, he is a devout Jew, and he comes in and he captures the temple again, and he purifies it. He reconsecrates it and makes it holy again and set apart for the worship of the one true God again. And so this festival of dedication, this festival of Hanukkah, became a celebration of God, of what God was doing, this reconsecration of the temple. And it lasted for 8 days. And this was to remind them of the fact that Judas Maccabeus had 1 day's worth of oil for the lamp, but it lasted for 8 days. And God made it last for 8 days. And it's such a fascinating story and just an interesting point in history. But this became a festival that the Jewish people celebrated. And this is the only place that it is mentioned in the New Testament. So here Jesus is there in Jerusalem for the festival of dedication, and it is winter. And we're told that he is in the temple courts walking in Solomon's colonnade. So if we were to transport ourselves back to that time and we were to see this temple up on the Temple Mount, there were these large porches around the courtyard. And this one particularly, Solomon's colonnade, was on the eastern side of the courtyard. And it would have been open to the courtyard, but would have had a wall to the outside. And at that time of year, there would have been very cold east winds blowing through and hitting the Temple Mount. I mean, it was higher than the other parts of the city, so it's just kind of there, and the wind is just going to hit it. And so these porches became places of shelter for teachers to use during the winter. And so we see Jesus in Solomon's colonnade, and one that would have been particularly sheltered from the cold winter wind. And this is where he is. And the Jews come to him and they want to know, are you the Messiah? Can you tell us plainly? Plainly, we just want a straight answer. And then Jesus is going to give them, of course, not the answer they want, which is just straight up yes or no. But instead, he gives them, I did tell you, but you did not believe. Then he goes on and says, the works I do in my Father's name testify about me. What I have already been doing, the works I have done, are the testimony. You've already been told, you've already been shown, but you don't recognize, you don't believe because you're not one of my sheep. He says, verse 27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So this was not the answer they were expecting. And then we're told once again, they pick up stones to stone him. What Jesus is saying here is that he is united with God the Father. He's united, sure, in purpose and in protection, and they both are taking care of the sheep and protecting the sheep. But then he says, I and the Father are one. And so we can hear that as, yes, they're united in purpose. What God is doing, Jesus is doing. But the reaction by the people hearing him tell us that they also understood what he was saying just a little bit differently. What they were hearing was, to their ears, blasphemy. If we look over at verse 33, it says, we're stoning you for blasphemy because you, a mere man, claim to be God. They were hearing him say, I and the Father are one. We are one. What they were hearing was Jesus claiming to be God. And here we see John's irony that he likes to throw in as we've been reading this gospel. We've seen it a few times. Jesus says, I've shown you many good works. Which one are you stoning me for? And then he has the people who are questioning Jesus' identity get it right with their question. Well, you're claiming to be God. We're stoning you for blasphemy, for claiming to be God. And it's very ironic that the people that it's like they're getting it right in reverse. They're wanting to stone him for what is true. So here Jesus is quoting in his defense, he's quoting from Psalm 82, verse 6. I encourage you to go and read it. But then if we were to look further about what else he's saying, he says, what about the one whom God set apart as his very own and sent into the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So I'm going to look at my notes because Lesslie Newbigin had a very interesting way of putting this explanation here. And then set this against the backdrop of the Feast of Dedication, so the Feast of Hanukkah, the celebration of the reconsecration of God's dwelling. And so then you have Jesus, who is the consecrated one sent into the world to be the place of God's tabernacling presence with humanity. And that is mostly Lesslie Newbigin's words, not mine, but the consecrated present. Jesus is the consecrated one sent into the world to be the place of God's tabernacling presence among humanity. So God is a God who is with us. He tabernacles. He sets his tent up with us. And Jesus is that place. He is the one who is that consecrated place. The temple was that. Now Jesus is that. It's just a very interesting point here in the midst of John's gospel with this celebration of the Feast of Hanukkah. And then again, we see their reaction is they want to seize him and probably stone him, but he escapes their grasp because we know his hour has not yet come. And we've been told several times in this gospel, it is coming soon though. But it says Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. There he stayed and many people came to him. They said, though John never performed a sign, all that John said about this man was true. And in that place, many believed in Jesus. So we have Jesus leaving Jerusalem and going into the wilderness to the Jordan, across the Jordan. Jesus leaves the place where was the seat of Jewish religious identity there, and where all of the people who should have known, they had all of the right information, they should have known, but they didn't. And yet he goes into the wilderness and he has people who are coming to him, and they believe. Many believed in Jesus. One of the things that resonated with me a lot this week is this idea of knowing the voice of the shepherd. My sheep listen to my voice. That's what verse 27 says. I know them and they follow me. And as I was thinking about this and I was hearing about how the shepherds in the Middle East communicate with their sheep and how the sheep are able to identify their specific shepherd's tune over and against the other ones and follow their shepherd, it just made me think about, how am I that in tune with God? How am I doing? Am I recognizing God's voice in that particular of a way that I can discern his voice, always discern his voice over and against all of the other voices that compete for my attention? I think that's a question we should all think through. Do we know what his voice sounds like? And how do we know what his voice sounds like? One of the answers that I always share is by spending time with him, spending time in communion with him. We learn what his voice sounds like by reading his word. We learn what his voice sounds like by praying and spending time listening. And not just talking, but listening to him. And if you want to talk more about that, I would love to. There's a lot more we could talk about than just this little tiny snippet in this video. And feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to you about that. But I think there is so much in chapter 10 for us to really reflect on and to see, are we really following Jesus as our good shepherd? We know his voice. We know what he sounds like. And are we willing to follow him wherever he leads us? So I hope you'll join me again next week. We're going to be talking about chapter 11, and it's going to be an interesting one because it is dealing with Lazarus and Jesus bringing him back to life. So I hope you'll join me. I'll see you then. Bye!